Welcome to this afternoon's Author Spotlight with Genevieve Graham. I'll begin with a land acknowledgement. The land we are standing on today is the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of Scugog Island First Nation and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. We acknowledge that Oshawa is covered under the Williams Treaties, and as settlers on these lands, we are all treaty people. May we respectfully honor the knowledge and understanding of the Indigenous stewards of these ancestral lands and ensure that the voices of the First Peoples are represented in our collections, programs, and services. We're thrilled this afternoon, in partnership with Blue Heron Books in Uxbridge, to welcome author Genevieve Graham, bestselling author of Canadian historical fiction. Genevieve Graham is the USA Today and #1 Globe and Mail and Toronto Star bestselling author of The Forgotten Home Child, Letters Across the Sea, Tides of Honor, Promises to Keep, Come From Away, and At the Mountain's Edge. Her latest novel, Bluebird, will be published in April 2022. She's passionate about breathing life back into Canadian history through tales of love and adventure. She lives in Halifax, Nova Scotia, and you can visit her at genevievegraham.com or on Twitter and Instagram at Jen Graham Author. And I've put those links in the chat. Genevieve will be doing a reading today from her 2021 novel, Letters Across the Sea, and will then follow this up with questions from you. I will then turn this over to Genevieve. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me today. I am very honored to be here to speak with you all today. As you mentioned, I'm going to be reading from Letters Across the Sea, and I suggest you settle back and get comfortable because this is for me, it's a short chapter, but it's 10 minutes long. The reason I am reading it, in case you have read Letters Across the Sea, you will know this chapter and you will know that I'm speaking about when Max returns from the war and his adjustment to being home again. The reason I chose this chapter, I know it may be a spoiler to anyone out there who has not finished the book, but I picked it because of Remembrance Day and the fact that as I researched the subject and learned about the Battle of Hong Kong and the POWs, it gave me a whole new insight into the POW experience and those who were swept under the rug when they got home. So that's from Max's perspective. It's chapter 23. Max hardly noticed the newcomer to the conversation. He couldn't take his eyes off Molly. Her hair was mussed from the ferocity of her hug, and her face was blotchy from crying, but she was still the most beautiful woman he'd ever seen. Hannah's brother? That Max? Whoa, the other man was saying. What was his name? Ian? Max turned reluctantly toward him. Welcome back from the dead, sir. We sure had it wrong, didn't we, Molly? What a coincidence for you two to run into each other here, of all places. I had no idea, she whispered. We all thought, what about your parents? Do they know you're here? Max nodded, taking in the freckles that dotted her nose, still not quite believing that she was standing in front of him. He tried to concentrate on her question. I got back here today. I cleaned up at the house, then my captain dragged me here. Today, Ian exclaimed. You must be exhausted. He lifted one shoulder, let it drop. I've been exhausted for years. What's one more night? I'm surprised your parents let you go. Her hypnotic green eyes held him like a lifeline. All those years of trying to forget, and he still felt exactly the same way about her. They must be so happy. Does Hannah know? Well, she wasn't there, but Mama will call her. They'll all be there tonight after this, I expect. The thought sent a skitter of anxiety through him. He might be here to speak with the press, but he wasn't prepared to answer his family's questions. She reached out her hand as if to check that he was really there, then thought better of it. Her fingers brushed his arm and his skin danced with nerves. God, I'm happy you're home. She was a mess for months, Ian said. The folks at the Red Cross and the War Office knew her well. She was determined to find you and all the others. She didn't give up for a long time. He remembered that, how she never gave up when she had something on her mind. He remembered everything about her. Yeah, we found out on the way back here that I didn't make the Red Cross list, Max said. Frankly, it probably wouldn't have made a difference on my end. Hardly anyone got letters in the camps, but I guess it would have been a big help to you. We thought you'd been killed, but nobody would tell us anything. It didn't make sense, Molly said. After we heard about Richie, I knew you had to be there somewhere. Max dropped his chin, eyes to the floor. I'm sorry about Richie, Mom. She had no idea how sorry. He wasn't sure he'd ever be able to tell her the full story. Ian had been watching intently, and now he turned to Molly. Say, I have an idea. Stop me if I'm wrong, but we came here to interview POWs, and it looks to me like you would like to talk. Maybe we could do both. She frowned at him. What are you suggesting? An in-depth interview. He focused on Max. You and Molly can talk, and I can take notes. We can meet at a cafe, buy you lunch. What do you think? It'd be more comfortable than standing here with all these people. Oh, no, Ian, I don't think that's fair to ask of Max. She hesitated, then turned to him, and despite all the years between them, he recognized the spark of interest in her expression. She liked the idea. Unless you want to. We wouldn't even have to name you in the article if you'd rather stay anonymous, Ian said. Maybe we could talk about Richie, Molly added, and he heard fear in her voice. He found himself nodding. I'm up for it if you are, he said, but he wasn't sure that was true. How's tomorrow? Ian asked. We can meet at the Senator at noon. Do you remember that spot at Young and Dundas? It's a nice place. We can keep to ourselves in there. Will that work? Sure. He caught a movement behind Ian. I'm sorry, but my sergeant's waving us out. They have a car for us, and I guess it's leaving. Duty calls, Molly said, trying to smile. At least this time I know I'll see you again. We have all the time in the world now. We sure do, he said, wishing he could hug her again. Ian stuck out his hand. It was a strong grip, which Max appreciated. It's so good to meet you at last, Max, really. He nudged Molly and winked. Guess this means we'll have one more invitation to send out for the wedding. Max's stomach plunged, and his gaze slipped to the plain gold band on her finger. When he looked up, Molly's face was flushed a dark pink. That's when he felt it begin again, the hardening of his heart, the construction of a wall that no emotions could penetrate. Over the past 4 years, that wall had saved Max's sanity so many times. He'd come home with no expectations, and tonight he'd leave this place with even fewer. Every light in the house was lit for Max's return, and as he stepped out of the hired car, he wished they hadn't done that. Of course, they'd want to see him, to talk, but right now it felt like too much. He wanted to sit in the dark, alone. The door flew open as he limped up the walk, and Hannah ran out to him, her arms held out. She collided with him, sank into his chest, and he lowered his face to her hair. Hannah, he said, feeling her whole body bump with sobs. She was a widow now, he remembered, thinking of David for the first time in a while, his body unmoving on the trampled grass. Guilt rushed through him. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry, Hannah. I couldn't save him. I couldn't bring him home. She leaned back, pale with understanding. Oh, Max, I knew you tried. I know you did. You couldn't do everything. She put her hands on his cheeks, holding his eyes with hers. But you came home. Oh, God, I still can't believe it. Thank you. Thank you for coming home. He held her again, and through his coat, he felt her fingers digging into his back, holding on tight. Over her shoulder, he saw his parents, their faces wet with tears. But his own was dry. How long since he'd cried? He couldn't remember. It's all right, he said to Hannah, then over her shoulder to his parents. It's all right now. They needed him to be strong. If only he could convince himself. Hannah finally released him, and the family ushered him into the living room, their voices ringing with happiness and laughter. Hannah's children hugged his knees so his progress was slow, and he had to stop himself from peeling them off him. He wanted to be here. He wanted to be with them, but their grips felt like bindings, and one of them was squeezing too tightly around his bum leg. He was relieved when he was able to sit, and they left him alone. The others settled into their chairs, happily commenting about what a wonderful day this was, watching him as if he were some sort of curiosity. Their eyes overflowed with love, and Max felt a tremor of panic. He'd seen their eyes before, at night, in the dark, with the rats scuttling nearby and the stink of men in his nostrils. He'd felt this love before, but only when he'd been beaten so badly he needed to cling to his memories for his own sanity. Was any of this real? It had to be a trick. How could he possibly be here? Then his mother appeared before him, smiling with adoration, a plate of latkes held out like an offering. He'd seen her do this before, seen her stirring pots in the kitchen and bringing food to him. He'd seen it all in his mind as he picked at the rotten grains of rice, moving with maggots. But those were just dreams, he remembered, wildly imagined fantasies of one day leaving the camp and finding himself again. They filled his mind to punish him because he didn't deserve that, not when all his friends were dead. Don't touch me, he cried, jerking away from his hallucination. But Bubala, no, he sprang out of his chair, knocking his mother's hands, and the plate crashed to the floor in a mess of broken china and latkes. With a squeak of alarm, Dinah raced behind Hannah's chair, but no one else moved a muscle and no one said a word. In the silence, he studied their stricken faces, slowly realizing it was not a dream after all. Then it dawned on him that what he was seeing in their eyes was fear. They were afraid of him. He'd done that. I'm sorry, he whispered. I'm sorry. Hannah slowly moved toward him, keeping her movements small. It will get easier, she said softly. I promise. I just need sleep, he said weakly, taking a step away from her. His mother's hands were bunched into fists in front of her mouth, and he could tell she was holding herself back. He was asking too much of her. If only he could let the anger go, hold her like she needed to be held, but he was afraid. Tomorrow is a new day for all of us, Hannah said softly. I know you don't understand this yet, but you are our miracle, Max. You're home. We will help you. For the first time, a knot jammed in his throat. He nodded quickly, burying his emotions again, then fled the room. Upstairs, nothing had changed in his bedroom. He marveled at the forgotten scene, thinking this made it seem like he'd only been away for a few hours, not 5 years. They hadn't packed up his things. They hadn't given up on him, even if he had. Out of habit, he moved slowly, afraid to make a noise, while he took off his coat and boots. He sat on the edge of his bed, feeling the softness of the mattress beneath him, letting his body remember the idea of comfort. Then he lowered himself to the floor, more at home with its hardness against his body. He was so tired, weary to the marrow of his bones. The knot in his throat loosened, and though it ached from holding back his tears for so long, at least he could breathe. He inhaled slowly, filling his lungs and hoping for peace, but anguish gripped him at the top. Grief came out in a groan, pushing from his gut, and the agony of the past 5 years rolled down his face. The images that had haunted him for years returned, stabbing him deeper and deeper. David's motionless body lying just out of reach. Richie's red, pleading eyes begging him not to leave. Arnie, wasted to nothing by the end, weighing no more than a child in his arms. He'd left them all behind, but their dead eyes still watched. He took a deep, shuddering breath, needing to find control again, but it was much too far away. Finally, he drifted off to sleep, and he felt the scratch of the barracks cement floor on his cheek. He heard the men down the row counting in Japanese in their sleep. He saw the arcing sword as it sliced through men's necks, ending their misery. So many times Max had envied those men, but he'd had to come back for David, for Arnie, and for Richie. And that's that.
Thank you so much. Like I know begin with, I'd said that I'd read one of your books in the past or two books actually, but I haven't read this one yet. So I have a little bit of a teaser now to draw me into that one. And I'm always a sucker for historical fiction of any kind. Now in the book that you just read from, Letters Across the Sea, the main characters are Jewish. One is Jewish.
One half is Max Dreyfus and his family are Jewish, and Molly Ryan and her family are Protestant.
Mm-hmm. So different perspectives there. And you've chosen to write about events like in the past, like Christie Pitt riots and the Canadian fascism in the 1930s. And I would say most people are likely unaware of these events. And I know you sort of pride yourself on exposing people to lesser known history. And even most people might not be aware of the Canadian defense of Hong Kong. And why did you choose to write about these topics that are perhaps lesser known?
Well, I have always been a historical fiction lover. I've read so much historical fiction, and I'm still highly addicted to it. Um, and I had never planned on being a writer. Actually, I was a classical musician for years, and that's what I thought I'd be doing. But I ended up starting to write in my 40s. I told my husband I just wanted to give it a try. And when I came back a couple of hours later from our dial-up internet computer, he said, you know, this isn't bad. And from that point on, I knew I was just gonna keep writing. I couldn't stop. The first couple of books I wrote, they're not in print anymore, but they were Scottish historical fiction. And that's where I got myself going on it.
We do have
But
a few
when
of
I
those,
moved, I grew up in
actually.
Toronto. Yes.
Yes, we have a
Um,
few of those on the shelf. Yes.
Perfect. When I grew up, it was in Toronto. And then I met my husband in Banff, and we lived in Calgary for 18 years. And then recently in 2008, we moved here to Nova Scotia. And when we moved here, all of a sudden I was surrounded by history. I live in a place that generations of families have lived in the same place for forever. The graveyards are filled with these generations of families, and they're also filled with the dead from the Titanic and the Halifax explosion. And when I started to learn all that, and I have to admit, I slept through history in class. I was not a historian. I was bored in history, and I forgot pretty much everything. I remember the War of 1812 and the Plains of Abraham and the fur trade. Who doesn't know the fur trade? But most of the stuff I'd never heard of before. And I had never heard of the Halifax explosion in my whole life. And the people here in Nova Scotia were shocked and dismayed at that. And I was shamed into learning about it. And as soon as I did, I was struck by the fact that with all the historical fiction I've read, most of it is set in Scotland, England, America, you know, anywhere but here. There are some amazing Canadian history books, but you don't see them very often in commercial fiction, which is what I write. And I wanted to learn more and more about it. The first book that I did was based on the Halifax explosion and World War I. That was this one, Tides of Honor. And as soon as I finished writing it, I realized that I needed to learn about more Canadian history, because I'd grown up, you know, thinking it was boring here. And the more I learn, the more I understand that our present day is built on our past, and our future is also based on our past to a certain extent. And it's so important that we learn it, but not just names, dates, and places. We need to really get into it. And so I kept writing historical fiction about Canada. And the story After Tides of Honor was based 25 years later in the same place, same family. And it talked about the U-boats that were skulking around our shores. That was this one, Come From Away. That is not the 9/11 story. I put the title on mine first before they did. But that one was based in Second World War. And here's the one that you said you wanted to read. I wrote about the Acadian expulsion. In this one, in 1755, the 10,000 Acadians were expelled in a horrible fashion from their homes. And that's another major part of our history. The next one was this one, the Klondike Gold Rush. I'm sure you have all of these in your library. And this one is about the Klondike Gold Rush and the early Mounties. Back in 2017, I'm always looking through different topics, different historical pages, different blogs and Instagram posts and Facebook posts. I'm always online looking at things and trying to find more Canadian history that I don't know about, which is a lot because I'm not a historian, but things that people don't constantly talk about. And in 2017, I ran across an article about the British home children, the 120,000 destitute children that were sent here to Canada from Great Britain to serve as indentured servants. Never heard of that. And now that I've studied it, I know that over 12% of Canadians are estimated to be descended from these kids, and over 4 million people, and most have no idea because the children, they mostly kept their stories to themselves out of humiliation. That resulted in this book, The Forgotten Home Child. And that really sort of exploded my books onto the scene and started introducing people to what I did and how important I feel Canadian history is. So I'm constantly looking at these stories. And I ran across, I can't even remember where I ran across Christy Pitt's Riot at one point, but having grown up in Toronto, I've been there. I was there on a field trip with my elementary school, I'm sure, and I've seen the plaque there, but I've never really looked at it. I never paid it any attention at all. But now, in this new life of mine, I realize it's not only Canadian history, but it's the largest ethnic riot in Canadian history. And that told me everything I needed to know, that I needed to write about this story. And I learned an incredible amount about what Canada was like then in the 1930s, but mostly what Toronto was like and in my city of birth. And it was just shocking. And at the second half of the story, the part that I lead to in what I just read, I wanted Max. Well, Max had to go to World War II. He had to stand up for himself. He had a lot of battles to fight. And so I started looking into where he would have been fighting. And I thought, I want to learn something new. And I know nothing about the Pacific Theater. I had no idea if we were even involved in anything in the Pacific Theater. And that's when I learned about the Battle of Hong Kong in 1941 and the Canadian POWs held by the Japanese for the longest POW imprisonment of anyone in the war, 44 months. I learned about that, and I learned about how when they returned, finally, after being freed, nobody paid them any attention. They were given no compensation, no apology, nothing. They were swept under the rug. Sending them away was a mistake. The government never should have sent them because these men were from garrison. They were on garrison duty. They were not trained for fighting. They were actually termed unfit for battle. They never should have been sent. And the story captured me. And I thought, these men deserve all of our, respect, and we need to know about them to start with. So that's where all of this came from. And I'm constantly looking for the next one. The book that you mentioned coming out in April is called Bluebird. And I'll just give you a little summary of that one. I'll just hit you with all of this stuff right up front. Bluebird starts in World War I at the Clearance Center hospitals. The only job that a Canadian woman was allowed to have overseas during World War I was as a Canadian nursing sister. And that was, they were called nursing sisters because they started as nuns, but over time they accepted nurses that were not nuns. And our nurses wore these blue gowns covered in white aprons. And because of the color, they were called Bluebirds, hence the name of the book. And she is going to meet the lead male in the story. His name is Jerry. And I discovered a group called it was one of the 3 Canadian battalions of tunnelers, which was another part of World War I that most people I've talked to have never heard about. These men dug 100 feet down underground and tunneled through in these 3 to 4 foot wide tunnels underneath the trenches to blow up the German trenches and also have underground battles with these Germans. So that's how they meet. And then I go a little bit farther. I am going to mention Spanish flu in it, of course, because I wrote it during all of this. And then what comes of all this is that they were both from Windsor, Ontario. And from there, I moved them home after the war, and I put them right in the middle of Prohibition, which was a very lively world back then. Michigan was the first state to go dry. And so Windsor was the most active place across Canada for Prohibition, rum running, bootlegging, all of that. So that's what Bluebird is all about. And I imagine it'll be in your library in April, but it's already available for pre-order if anybody is into that as well. And you can look at all of that on my website.
Lots of things to add to our reading list. I know we have members of our various an audiobook club that we have here at the library, as well as our regular book clubs. And one of the members of that book club has said, thank you so much for making sure your books are available in audio format.
Yes.
I'm an audiobook user myself, and I tend to go between ebooks and audiobooks. And something comes alive when I'm listening to something like that. But I tend to go back and forth between, because yours includes enough detail that I'm able to sort of it pushes me to want to read more about the topic.
Mhm.
I can always tell a really good novel when I've read it and it makes me think, and I stop for a minute and I have to go do research on my own to sort of, find more background. And I really
Yeah.
enjoy that part. But there's a comment from somebody talking about how the new book that you're reading, that you did the reading from, sounds so powerful and they can't wait to read it. Marcy has said. She has a question though. She says, how do you manage to build in the nonfiction with the fiction? She said she's read some historical fiction where the author goes so deep into the nonfiction that it kind of loses some of the underlying story. And she said, you've done an amazing job of illustrating the horror of war through your characters. So she really, that was her question. How do you find putting it into fiction and making it very accessible and
Thank
interesting?
you. Thank you very much. Okay, so for me, all this history is new. I don't know anything about it when I start out. And so what I'm really doing is teaching myself first. And so I learn all the history. The way I do my research is that I look at it, first of all, like a black and white photo. It's history is done. It's not tangible. It's something that normally I wouldn't really think about until I start doing my research, and the details that I am able to dig up have to be so, like, the tiniest thing has to be looked up, and that's what starts to colorize the photo for me and brings it to life by doing that. And when I mean research, I mean I learn all the basic things, their politics and their fashion and their food and things like that, but I also learn little tiny things like what kind of hairbrush she would have learned or used, and if she's walking down a street, I want to be able to see that street and see if there's shops on it and what the road is made of and what's in that shop window and what's it used for and how much does it cost and how is she going to use it when she gets home. So from all these tiny little bits of information, that's where my characters come from. I don't have the story in my head before it starts. It's all based on the history first, but it is the details of the history that bring the character and story alive because I follow them through their own story. I know what you mean about there being a lot of historical fiction books that have a lot of information. Sometimes it can really weigh you down. And for me, the books need to move. I see them like a film, and I don't want to stop and go into depth and figure out what I'm doing. I want the film to continue smoothly, and I want to understand the characters. So what I do is I remember that these people, my characters do become people to me, and they don't know, they know a fraction of what I know about the history that they're living in. For example, when I wrote about the Halifax explosion, Danny Baker, who is my lead in that one, he gets caught up in the snowstorm the day that follows. And I knew the temperature of the air that day. I knew how many inches of snow fell, and I knew everything that was going on at the time. What I had to do was make sure that Danny knew what Danny knew. So Danny would tighten his scarf because he knew it was cold. His fingers were numb and the snow was coming in over his boots. That's all he knew. He didn't know 18 inches or anything like that. So I have to always tell the story from their perspective. And I find it's easy to dump historical information. It's like, I know far too much stuff now, and I could put it all into my books. But what's the point in that? The point is that I tell a story about a moment in history, and I write it so that these characters connect to you. That's the most important part to me, is that I bring the history alive in a way that you can identify and you get to know these people and care about these people. It's emotion that connects you to history. And if you love them, then you're not going to forget the history. My terrible analogy is that if you see a car crash, you're going to remember it for a couple of days. But if you know someone in that car crash, you're never going to forget it. And so that's sort of what I'm going for. And if I load it down with information, I don't know about you, but if it's me, I'm going to close the book because I just can't. It's too much work for me. So I hope that answers your question. The stories, to me, the characters tell them, and so they couldn't possibly know all those details.
I think one of the questions, or one of the things I'd read an interview that you gave talking about how you did research for the Forgotten Home Child, and you were using a lot of Facebook groups, and people have so much knowledge out there, groups of, sort of crowdsourcing information and doing questionnaires with these people about, they had memories of their parents talking about being home children, and you compiled those into real life details you could insert for the characters in the novel, which I think lends a lot of realism to the fiction. Like you say, it seems like you could just drop yourself into the novel and feel like you're in it, like a movie. And I felt very much like that when I was reading The Forgotten Home Child. So
But
yeah,
it's and writing The Forgotten Home Child, well, it was the most emotional thing I've ever done, but all the research and everything. But yeah, what I did was I connected with the Facebook page of the British Home Children Advocacy and Research Association, and I went to their Facebook page and I mentioned that I wanted to write a book about them. And the people in that group, there were thousands of them, and they were all descendants of British home children. And they opened their arms and their hearts to me, and they were so eager for me to tell their stories. So when I did put a survey together, and I put it on the page, and I expected that I would get a couple back in a week. And it asked questions like, what do you recall about your ancestor if you knew them? And can you give me an adjective that would describe how they felt about their lives here? And all these little personal questions. And I didn't get one or two back. I got 200 back within the first week. And so I had to comb through them all, which I can tell you was absolutely heartbreaking. And when I found the stories that worked best, I was able to kind of blend them all together and create the characters. And so I can honestly say that everything that happened to the characters in my book happened in real life, because all of these things came from the survey responses that I received. And yeah, it makes it genuine. It's the real deal.
There's another question related to that, sort of your research into the newest novel. She said she'd read an interview that you'd given about Bluebird, where you mentioned that you had been inspired by Peaky Blinders, the show on TV, for Bluebird. And she said she's a huge fan of the show. And she knows that the main character, Tommy Shelby, and your character, Jerry, have a lot in common. And they both worked in the tunnels during World War I. And in the show, Tommy is still haunted by working in the tunnels and has PTSD, what they call now. And she's wondering if this is something that also affects Jerry after the war. So your character after the war.
Definitely. Peaky Blinders was a huge influence on me when I started to read it. There were two reasons that I got into writing about the bootleggers. I wanted to for a long time, because out here in Maritimes, everybody knows someone who was a rum runner. It's very funny. From the beginning, they wrote to me and said, please write about this and I'll tell you about my uncle. But I kept putting it off. And then there were two things that got me interested in it and convinced me now was the time to write it. And the first was that I read an article in the New York Post about a couple who had bought a house in New York that was from the 1920s and apparently built by a bootlegger. And as they started to renovate, they started to take the outside of the house down, and they found all sorts of bottles that were wrapped up inside from the 1920s. And that was so exciting to read about that and see, well, that could turn into a wonderful story. And then I got hooked on Peaky Blinders. And when I learned more about Peaky Blinders it's a very violent show. And if you're not into that, then that's understandable. For me, it's very beautifully done, and it's very introspective, and it spends a lot of time dealing with shell shock, which was PTSD, which is something that I explore all the time in my books, because we don't spend enough resources taking care of the people that suffer from that, in my opinion. But Tommy introduced me to the tunnelers, and I went digging, if you can say that about tunneling, and I discovered then that the Canadians did have 3 tunneling battalions, and I thought, well, that's perfect. And just so you know, when I am writing these male characters, I usually picture an actor in my head, and I am very much using the actor Cillian Murphy, who portrays Tommy Shelby, when I write about him. So he's not going to be exactly the same, obviously. He's not a violent man. He's not a bully, but a lot of what he suffers and remembers comes from similar background to him. So I hope that you enjoy it, and I hope that when you're reading it, you will maybe see a little bit of Tommy Shelby in there. I hope so.
I haven't actually gotten into watching Peaky Blinders myself. People have always told me I'd love it because I'm really into historical fiction. I could put it off and put it off, and now I really have to watch it because
It's really something. It's really an amazing story, and it's based on a true, well, sort of loosely based on a gang of criminals back then, but they've expanded it into a big story, and it is very violent. You have to be ready for that, but it's done beautifully in my opinion. So I highly recommend it. And season 6 comes in January, so I got to watch it all over again.
But in between writing your book a year, you told me earlier that you're planning to write a book a year, which is very ambitious, but you seem to be pulling that off. You're coming out with one every other day. I look around and think, oh, she's written another one because the year has gone by. So I know that you've got the Bluebird sort of in the bag and being released. So do you have the plan for the next one on the horizon?
I do. I'm still working on it, so I'm not really sharing what it's about, but it will be set in World War II, and it will involve four main characters this time instead of 2, and they all are Canadian, and I'm shedding light on 4 parts of the war that we didn't even hear about till recently, because a lot of people had signed an oath of secrecy on pain of death, and now that oath is done after 60 years, and so I'm reading stories now from these people that are amazing, and I think it's going to make quite an exciting story. Actually, that will be in 2023. They're all coming out in the spring, it seems, so I'm going to say probably April 2023.
So you're on track for that. So that's really exciting.
Yeah.
There was a question from Wendy, to go back to something we talked about earlier. She wants to know, in which book is the Christie Pitts riots were discussed?
Oh, that's Letters Across the Sea. That's the one that just came out.
Okay. And Rachel just wanted to say thank you. It was her question. She'd asked about the tunnelers and the reference to the Peaky Blinders. So she just wanted to say thank you for that. I know that I had a colleague of mine who was hoping to be involved in this program today and wasn't able to, but he had a question. He'd said that your writing is so well researched and you take the time to include details, as we've talked about. He gives an example about when you wrote about the Royal Regiment of Canada, which is now a primary reserve unit in Toronto, which was housed in the Equestrian Building on Exhibition Grounds. He said his grandfather was one of the Royal Regiment of Canada, and he described to my colleague being housed in the Equestrian Building and how it smelled of horses, and that they were glad to get out of there. So that little bit of history there. And he said, where do you find the details and what inspires you to include them in your writing? So I think you've talked about this before, but I wanted to mention that there's these stories that people have of their families that they might be seeing in your books, which resonates really well with them, or the stories they remembered someone having. And my colleague had said he'd forgotten about that until he read your book. And then he's like, oh.
And you should tell him that in the next book, I am one of the characters is a Wren. She's with the Navy here, but in the women's division, they were called the Wrens. And when she went to sign up and get her medical, the signs were there, and they had the enlisted men going into the horses' stalls and the officers going into the area where the pigs were. And they thought that was very funny. So they, yeah, I think knowing all this, it's just digging and digging and disappearing through rabbit holes and spending endless hours sitting here and learning until my husband finally comes upstairs around 5:30 and says, here's a glass of wine. It's time for you to come downstairs because I haven't seen you for 12 hours. And I forget all time and place when I'm writing. And that's the only way I could write a book a year, I think. And it is a crazy goal that I've put out there, but so far so good.
I know it's kind of a question that you probably get from libraries all the time, but I know you said you're a really voracious reader of historical fiction. Do you have a favorite, or what got you into reading historical fiction to begin with?
That would have to be Outlander. My mother introduced me to Outlander when I have 2 daughters, both of whom have just graduated from Dalhousie University out here. But at the time they were I think there were 4 and 6, and she handed me a copy of Outlander, and she said, "You haven't read a book in so long, and this is the book that's going to get you going." And I will admit that between the audiobooks and the hard books, I've read them 7 times, the entire series, and I'm waiting for the next one to come out later this month. So Outlander was a huge influence. The books, not the TV show, and I have read every. Scottish history was the thing for me back then, and it's sort of shifted now. I'm a lot more into World War II, World War One, early 20th century stories.
I know Outlander tends to be a bit of a jumping off point for a lot of people getting into historical fiction. That was like when they were first released anyway, kind of this groundswell of novelists came out after that, inspired by it. And the TV show resulted in, I think, a resurgence in interest with the novels.
Yes.
My mother now loves the television show, and I've been telling her for years to read the books, but she's not a reader. She doesn't like to sit down and concentrate on a novel. She wants it told to her in the form of a film. So when she said to me,
the audible for that is so good.
I know I've gotten through 5 of the Outlander books myself, and I'm on book 6, and they're a commitment. I listen to them in audio as I'm doing other things. It takes 20 to 30 hours, I think, and her books keep getting thicker and thicker and thicker. A lot of historical detail there, but I always like to ask that question of our authors, because, as librarians, we're always talking about, if you like this author, you might like these others. Are there contemporary authors that you enjoy as well? Like, are some of your contemporaries that write historical fiction that you really love?
Oh yeah, there's so many right now and we're all friends, which is really great. Of course, there's Jennifer Robson. She's in Toronto, and she's constantly writing something brilliant. I've made friends with Kristen Harmel, Julia Kelly. She's got a new one coming out this month. Roxanne Valetzos. There's so many. My latest friend is AJ Pierce, who wrote Dear Mrs. Bird, and she has another one out called Yours Faithfully, I think, or Yours. I can't remember the name of it. I actually got to know a lot of them starting in March 2020, when the lockdowns first started. This happened with both of my books, with Forgotten Home Child and with Letters Across the Sea. They both came out 1 week before lockdown. So all I could do was stand outside and look at my books. I couldn't even touch them. And I thought, well, I'm not the only one going through this. So I started up crazy, because I never used to be comfortable in front of a camera, but I started up a little video series where I interview historical fiction authors. And I invite them into my Facebook page, and we talk, and they read a chapter from their books. And I have met some of the greatest authors that way. Kate Quinn has been on there, and she's now a good friend of mine, and Pam Jenoff, and so many. I think I have a couple of dozen interviews on there now, which you can always find if you're interested in them. And they are interesting, because these authors are all very interesting. It's over on my Facebook page if you look under the videos at Historical Fiction Author Chats.
Speaking of videos, there's a question of if you would like to have any of your books made into a movie.
I would love that. Movie or a TV series. I can tell you that someone right now has bought the film option rights for The Forgotten Home Child. But I need to clarify that the film option rights does not mean that there is a production in place. What it means is they have a year or two, depending on how much they pay for it, to get everything ready. They have to do the screenplay and the finances and set all the behind the scenes stuff up there. And I think they have to sell it as well before it will be made into any kind of production. So I got my fingers crossed. They're talking about a 6-part miniseries, and I would just love that. So everybody cross your fingers on that one. It's a company out of Toronto that's talking about doing it. So
well, we like a local as well, right? So to tell the story of a lesser known part of Canadian history.
Definitely.
There was another question that had come in, just about your writing process. It said, you mentioned that you didn't start writing until you were sort of like a second career sort of thing. You said you were doing before you were like in a professional, you studied professional music, right? To play the oboe, I believe.
Yes. Yeah.
And so jumping into writing, you mentioned sort of in your 40s. So I think it gives those of us that think about, oh, it's too late to start. Have you ever, people talk about joining that NaNoWriMo, which is the, writing a novel, like writing a little bit every day, and encouraging people to do that. So I think, what kind of tips would you have for aspiring writers?
Yeah, NaNoWriMo is going on right now, I think every November. And I'll tell you, that thing scares the daylights out of me. I could not crush it all in, but it's different when it's historical, because then you have to have research in there as well. My writing process is very disorganized, but I guess it's organized enough that I'm getting it all done. But I start with knowing what kind of project I want to do, and then I just will sit and dig into the research until I start to get a more clear picture of who the characters are. I do not plot my books in advance, although I have tried. I am not a plotter. I am a pantser, meaning I write by the seat of my pants. But I do try. Like, I've been writing more and more outlines lately. And then my latest, when I sent to my editor, she said, "You made a plan. I'm so proud of you." So I do try to be organized, because it sure would be easier if I did that. But I'm not a very organized person at heart, so I'm not surprised that my writing is not very organized. I just find it really important that I do it all the time. I write every day. If I'm not writing, I'm researching, and it's about 50-50 of both. So if I find something that in my research, maybe it was something I wasn't even looking for, I will grab it and I'll see where I can sew it into the book. Other than that, I'll be researching and I'll figure out where I can put it in the future, and it all comes together organically. Eventually. Oh, I think you're muted.
I am muted. Thank you. I was being careful to mute myself so you wouldn't hear me typing in the background. You said that, bringing up the question here about your website and talking about video and promotion and things, that you create book trailers for some of your books, and the process of that. Do you find that very useful tool for promotion, or you enjoy doing that? Do you advise other writers to do the same?
I do it because I love doing it. And I don't really know why I love doing it, because I use the iMovie to make it, and it's really hard. Like, they don't make it easy. It's not user friendly like they talk about. But I don't know. I like to be able to, the synopsis in the back of a book is one thing, and I like to shorten it up even more and make it into sort of a visual thing. I don't know too many authors that do it. Kay Quinn does. Most people, if they're doing it, they pay others to do it. And I wouldn't do it. I wouldn't pay someone to do it, because I don't think it really does much good promotion wise. I do it for more interest, visual interest, and I will pay for certain things. Like, I'll pay for the music in the background. I'll pay for specific pictures if they are what I need. And the hardest part of those is you have to keep them like under 30 seconds, and you pretty much have to summarize everything about the book in little tiny lines through those things. So they're not easy to make. Every time you see one, you have to go, "Oh, that person did some work."
I can echo your comments about iMovie. I was trying to teach myself it this week. And they make it look easy in all the instructional videos I've watched, but I have such respect for you for for creating those with that, and making that possible. I don't know if there's any other questions coming in. I will mention that I've put Genevieve's link to her website, as well as links to our library catalog to find Genevieve's books, which we carry all of her more recent novels, as well as some of her earlier Scottish historical fiction, which are, interesting covers there, like, showing the very Scottish lord there.
But I should tell you about those books. If you take those out, I should tell you, I was really upset with the covers of these books. And in case anyone doesn't know, authors have no say over the covers of their books. We don't get anything. Simon & Schuster asks me out of politeness if I like what they are planning to do, but Penguin did not ask me at all. And I was very disappointed in the books. So when you pick them up, they look very much like Harlequin type books. And as great as that is, as a genre, as a subgenre of the Harlequin style, I don't write it. I don't write fluffy pieces. I don't write sex. I don't write anything like that. My books are, especially those ones, are a little bit violent, And so when they did that cover, the people that wanted to read stuff like what I'd written would not pick that up. I wouldn't have picked that up. So if you do take them out, just be prepared. They are not light, fluffy romances as they appear to be. They're out of print right now, and I'm hoping one day I want to write a fourth in the series and re-release them someday.
With nicer, with more covers that are more in keeping with what you would prefer.
Yes.
They do, interestingly, you mentioned they're not romance. We do have some of yours in romance, but your more recent are in just general fiction.
Right.
But I think depending on how they come from the publisher, they'd be put in the romance section. So I had to look in 4 different places to find your books in the library. So, but I've put links in the description or in the chat box. And please visit Genevieve's website and follow her online. And we're so thankful to you for joining us today and sharing with us all the new developments coming up and us adding new books to our list. We'd love to have you back again in the future to talk about your next book.
I would love to come. Thank you so much for having me. This hour just flew by. You asked me a few questions and I never stopped. So thank you very much for having me.
Thank you. Goodbye, everyone. Thank you.